Tucked along an old, forgotten stretch of Colorado's mountain highway stood Hope and Grit, a modest roadside diner barely clinging to life. For 25 years, Clarence Reed, a 56-year-old widowed black man, had kept the lights on, serving weary truckers, miners, and lone travelers with hot meals and quiet dignity. But times had changed. The road was no longer busy, and the bank had just issued a final notice: 5 days to vacate. That night, as snow blanketed the peaks and visibility dropped to zero, Clarence flipped the sign to closed, believing it might be the last time. Then, through the howl of the wind, came the unmistakable roar of engines, 10 motorcycles struggling through the storm, their riders unknowingly riding straight into the warmest place left on that cold, empty road. Clarence was wiping down the counter, the silence of the diner interrupted only by the ticking of an old wall clock and the occasional groan of wind pushing against the windows. The snowstorm outside had turned violent, coating the world in a whiteout that made even the closest fence posts disappear. Just as he reached to turn off the last light above the pie display, something caught his eye. Headlights swaying erratically, then a sudden thud. He rushed to the front door and squinted through the frost-covered glass. A motorcycle had skidded onto the shoulder, its rider struggling to stand against the merciless wind. Without a second thought, Clarence threw on his coat, pushed open the door, and braved the icy air. It cut through his jacket like knives, but he pressed forward, lifting the heavy bike alongside the man and guiding him into the warm glow of Hope and Grit. Before the man could even thaw, more lights pierced the curtain of snow. 9 more motorcycles, all following the same doomed path through the storm. One by one, they pulled in, soaked and shivering, their faces etched with fatigue. Clarence didn't hesitate. He lit up the kitchen, started a fresh pot of coffee, and told them they could stay as long as they needed. They were grateful but cautious, nodding politely as they warmed their hands near the radiator. Their leather jackets bore the same patch, a worn but proud insignia reading Iron Vows Motorcycle Club. They weren't the typical weekend riders. Their bodies were marked with stories, tattoos, scars, and eyes that had seen too much. Some looked like ex-cons, others like former soldiers, and a few young ones still had the hardened alertness of street survivors. Clarence, though, asked no questions. He saw them not as threats, but as men caught in the same cold world he was, just trying to get through the night. He didn't know their backgrounds, and they didn't know his. But sitting around the worn-out booths and chipped mugs, something unspoken passed between them, a mutual recognition of grit, loss, and survival. What Clarence didn't realize, however, was that among those 10 bikers was someone who owed him more than just shelter. Years ago, a hungry, frightened teenage runaway had wandered into this same diner. Clarence had offered him a sandwich, a coat, and a place to sleep by the heater in the back room. He never asked the boy's name, never called the cops. That boy grew up, changed his life, and eventually became one of the founding members of the Iron Vows, an organization that now spanned 5 states and quietly helped veterans, addicts, and the wrongfully incarcerated find their footing again. But on that stormy night, Clarence didn't know any of this. To him, they were just 10 strangers in need of a roof, a bowl of stew, and a little dignity. And that simple act of compassion, born from years of quiet resilience, would soon set off a chain of events that no one, not even Clarence, could have ever predicted. The storm hadn't yet passed when Clarence found the envelope taped to his front door. Thick, official, and cold as the wind that had delivered it. It was a final notice from Jefferson County Bank. He had 5 days to vacate the premises. The land beneath Hope and Grit had been quietly purchased by Horizon Development Group, a powerful investment firm planning to bulldoze the area for a modern gas and retail stop that promised progress and economic growth. The face behind the deal made Clarence's heart tighten. Derek Langston, a smooth-talking, sharply dressed real estate mogul who had once sat at a booth in Clarence's diner as a young man, full of entitlement and contempt. Decades ago, they'd clashed when Derek, then a local intern for the mayor's office, suggested Clarence clean the place up or sell it to someone who knew what to do with real estate. Clarence had politely but firmly told him to take his suggestions elsewhere. Now Derek was back, not as an intern, but as the architect of Clarence's erasure. The paperwork was airtight. The property had been appraised far below its actual worth, thanks to backdoor dealings with the zoning commission. Clarence, behind on his taxes after a tough year, had unknowingly fallen into the trap they'd been quietly building. "There's no place for nostalgia in business," Derek had told the local paper in a statement. "We're bringing this town into the future." To him, Clarence's diner wasn't a sanctuary, it was an eyesore, a relic of a past best paved over. Clarence sat alone that night after the bikers had gone to sleep, the eviction notice spread out on the counter next to his old coffee mug. He didn't have the money, the lawyers, or the connections to fight a corporation like Horizon. But what Derek Langston didn't understand, what no spreadsheet or market analysis could calculate, was the depth of loyalty forged by kindness, or the network of silent gratitude Clarence had unknowingly built over the years. Every meal he'd served, every kid he'd fed without question, every traveler he'd helped during a storm had planted seeds. And now, on the edge of losing everything, those seeds were beginning to stir. The real conflict wasn't just about a piece of land, it was about dignity, memory, and whether people like Clarence still had a place in a world obsessed with progress. Derek believed the fight was already over, that Clarence was just another old man clinging to a fading past. What he didn't see coming was a reckoning, not loud, not violent, but unstoppable. A quiet uprising powered by stories, loyalty, and a community that had never forgotten where they once found shelter on a cold night. And just 5 days before the bulldozers were scheduled to roll in, a single spark, lit by a group of unexpected allies, was about to turn the whole game upside down. Later that night, long after the last pot of coffee had gone cold and the storm had finally quieted to a whisper, Clarence found himself sitting across from Lance, the tall, broad-shouldered biker with a long scar running from temple to jaw. The others had settled into sleeping bags on the diner floor, but Lance remained restless, his eyes tracing the photos on the wall behind the counter. Clarence poured them both a fresh cup, the silence between them familiar but not uncomfortable. Then, out of nowhere, Lance asked, "You ever remember a kid, about 15, showed up here one winter, starving, no shoes, nowhere to go?" Clarence's brows furrowed, the memory slowly rising from beneath years of routine. He nodded slowly. "You gave him chili, a cot in the kitchen, and didn't ask a single damn question," Lance continued, his voice quieter now. "That was me." Clarence blinked, stunned, the scar on Lance's face suddenly triggering full recognition. The runaway boy he once helped without hesitation now sat before him. A grown man, hardened but steady, leading the very group of men Clarence had just sheltered. But the surprises weren't over. Lance went on to explain that Iron Vows had evolved far beyond a motorcycle club. What started as a brotherhood for outcasts had become an underground justice network, an informal but fiercely committed alliance of mechanics, lawyers, ex-military, journalists, engineers, and even digital security experts. They operated in the margins, picking up cases the system ignored: wrongful evictions, predatory lending, forgotten veterans, and small-town corruption. "We don't wear badges," Lance said, "but we've stopped more than a few bad deals from going through." As Lance laid out his story, Clarence listened in quiet awe. He had thought the kindness he'd shown that boy so many years ago had faded into the past. But that single act had grown roots, traveled through people and time, and transformed into something he never could have imagined. Lance pulled out a weathered leather binder from his backpack and laid it on the counter. Inside were documents, land records, zoning maps, and most importantly, a copy of the foreclosure file Clarence had received. "This whole thing smells off," Lance said. "Way off. One of our guys is a land use attorney out of Denver, another one's a journalist at the Gazette. We're already digging." Clarence stared at the binder, overwhelmed. "Why would you do all this, for me?" Lance met his eyes. "You didn't ask for anything back then. You didn't need a reason to help me. Now I don't either." For the first time in days, Clarence felt something shift. The hopelessness that had taken root in his chest began to crack, replaced by the unfamiliar warmth of hope. He wasn't alone anymore. What he thought was the end of the road had become a new beginning, and it all started with a bowl of chili and a decision to open the door, instead of closing it, on a freezing winter night 20 years ago. What Clarence didn't see coming, what no one saw coming, was that among the 10 bikers sleeping on his diner floor was Tessa Langston, a sharp-eyed young woman with a pixie cut and an Iron Vows patch stitched carefully onto her leather jacket. Over the past few days, she had kept mostly to herself, quietly observing and listening. But late the next afternoon, as the snow finally began to melt and the sun broke through the heavy grey, she approached Clarence with a flash drive in hand and a solemn look on her face. "You need to see this," she said, placing the device on the counter. "And you'll want to be sitting down." What followed was a stunning confession. Tessa was the daughter of Daniel Langston, Horizon's chief financial officer, and younger brother to Derek Langston, the face of the land acquisition project. While the Langston name had opened every door in the corporate world, Tessa had rejected that path years ago, choosing instead to ride with Iron Vows, drawn to their mission of justice over greed. But blood ties still gave her access to internal servers, confidential emails, and boardroom recordings. For months, she had been quietly compiling evidence, unsure when or how to use it. Clarence's diner became the tipping point. The flash drive contained a trove of documents, internal emails detailing undisclosed financial transactions, evidence of shell companies used to funnel money, and most damning of all, audio recordings of Derek Langston boasting about paying off county zoning officials to devalue Hope and Grit's property and push Clarence out without a fight. The recordings were chilling in their arrogance, statements like, "The old man won't know what hit him. That patch of dirt is as good as ours." Within 48 hours, the Iron Vows mobilized. A media contact released a special investigative piece in the Sunday paper, complete with excerpts from the recordings and screenshots of the falsified appraisals. Clarence's story, once dismissed as a quaint struggle of a man resisting change, was now headline news: snowstorm, scandal, and a diner that wouldn't die. The county called an emergency public hearing at the municipal hall, the room packed with reporters, townspeople, and community leaders. Tessa, standing beside Clarence, testified under oath, revealing her identity and explaining why she had turned on her own family. The air was electric with tension as the recordings were played aloud, each line digging deeper into the truth of what had been planned. At the back of the room, Derek Langston, red-faced and surrounded by his lawyers, could do nothing but watch as the carefully built facade of Horizon crumbled. Clarence, seated in the front row in his neatly pressed flannel shirt and worn boots, looked like any other small-town diner owner, except now the entire community saw something more. He was no longer just the man who flipped pancakes and poured coffee. He had become a symbol of resistance, of memory, and of what real integrity looked like when tested by power. When the crowd rose to its feet in a standing ovation, Clarence didn't smile for the cameras or puff his chest in victory. He simply tipped his cap to Tessa and said, "Your father may have built towers, but you just built something stronger." In that moment, the truth wasn't just revealed. It rewrote the narrative, not only for Clarence, but for an entire town learning how easily the line between progress and corruption can blur. The courtroom decision came swiftly and decisively. In light of the overwhelming evidence, the judge ordered an immediate halt to all Horizon development projects in the region and launched a formal investigation into the company's practices and its ties to local officials. But the ruling didn't just stop the bulldozers, it set off a chain of community action. After reviewing Clarence's long-standing presence and unrecorded contributions to the town, the council designated Hope and Grit as an official community heritage site, granting Clarence legal custodianship of the land and protection from future commercial development. The announcement spread like wildfire, not just in Colorado, but across biker networks, online forums, and small-town news outlets. The very next morning, as the sun rose over the snowy peaks, more than 200 motorcycles lined the mountain highway. Harleys, Hondas, vintage cruisers, and rebuilt choppers, all rumbling in unison toward the diner. Riders came from every corner of the state, some even from neighboring counties, drawn by the story of a man whose quiet generosity had touched more lives than he ever knew. They called it the Rescue Ride. The event wasn't organized, but it didn't need to be. It was instinct, a call to gather around someone who had once opened his door to strangers during their darkest nights. Throughout the day, the parking lot overflowed with bikes and laughter. as men and women in leather shared food, stories, and tears. A makeshift banner that read, "Thank you, Clarence," stretched across the front windows, and local musicians played acoustic sets on the steps beside the pie display. Some brought photos of themselves as teens, runaways, addicts, veterans, posing in front of the diner from decades ago. One older rider, his voice shaking as he held a coffee cup between weathered hands, said simply, "I came here in '93 with frostbite and a broken foot." He didn't ask for my name, just handed me soup and said, "Eat first, talk later." That man didn't just keep a fire going in that kitchen, he kept it alive in souls that were about to go cold. Clarence stood near the doorway most of the day, humbled and overwhelmed, shaking hands, sharing hugs, and quietly thanking each person who came. He didn't see himself as a hero, just a man who did what he thought was right. But in the eyes of those who returned, he was something more. A steady flame in a world that often forgot how much warmth a little kindness could give. As evening fell, the sky turned a soft lavender, and the roar of engines turned into a steady hum of connection. The town's mayor stopped by to announce that Hope and Grit would now be the centerpiece of a new annual event. Rescue Day, a celebration of community resilience and unsung heroes. Local businesses pledged support, and regional news crews captured the day in footage that would later go viral. But Clarence wasn't thinking about headlines. He was thinking about every plate he'd served, every kid he'd fed, every tired driver he'd offered coffee to, and how those small, forgotten moments had somehow circled back into something bigger than he ever imagined. The diner, once a dying memory, was now a living monument. And Clarence Reed, who thought he'd been left behind by progress, had become its very definition, just in a language built not on profit, but on people. 1 year later, Hope and Grit was no longer just a roadside diner. It had become a landmark. Nestled in the mountains of Colorado, it now served not only food but purpose, acting as a beacon for travelers, a safe haven for those in crisis, and the heart of a growing movement. Community events were held monthly, including job fairs, free meals for veterans, and youth mentorship nights. Clarence Reed, once seen as a relic of a bygone era, had been honored at the state capitol with the Civic Light Award, the highest recognition for public service and humanitarian spirit. People from across the country sent letters, visited the diner, and told stories of how Clarence's kindness, whether experienced directly or through the now viral story, had restored their faith in people. On the flip side, Derek Langston had become a cautionary tale. Stripped of his corporate power and under federal investigation for fraud and bribery, he faded into the background of headlines he once paid to control. On a cold March morning, he stepped out of a now-shuttered Horizon branch, shoulders hunched under a wrinkled overcoat, and looked across the road where over 50 motorcycles had quietly gathered in front of Hope and Grit. No one was protesting or shouting. They were simply present, engines humming in a unified reminder. Some things money can't buy, like trust, honor, and the loyalty built from a hot meal and an open door. In a world that often measures success by market value and influence, Clarence's story reminds us that impact is not always loud, but it is lasting. A single bowl of soup on a snowy night, offered without condition or expectation, can ripple outward in ways we may never see. It can plant seeds in people's lives, seeds that one day grow into movements, actions, and decisions that turn the tide of injustice. Kindness isn't weakness, it's foresight. It is the quiet, persistent force that holds communities together when systems fail. No one is ever too small to make a difference. The fire you keep burning for someone else today may be the very light that guides a crowd home tomorrow. And in Clarence's case, it did more than that. It exposed corruption, united strangers, and redefined the meaning of progress. He didn't do it with speeches nor with money, but with a daily decision to keep his doors open, to keep saying yes when it was easier to say no. The universe has a way of echoing back what we put out into it. It may not be instant, it may not be glamorous, but it always finds a way to restore balance. So the next time you're faced with a moment where no one's watching and the choice is yours, choose compassion. Because it's not just the right thing to do, it may be the spark that sets off an entire chain reaction of change. And if you ever wonder whether small acts matter, just remember the name Hope and Grit, a diner that almost disappeared and instead became a legend. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that courage can be quiet and justice can start with just one person choosing kindness, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to X Daily Stories. Here we bring you more than just feel-good moments. We bring you the real power of human decency, told through unforgettable narratives that shine a light on those who change the world by simply doing the right thing. Each week, we highlight true or inspired stories of redemption, resistance, and resilience from everyday people just like you. Be part of our growing community and help us spread stories that deserve to be remembered. Subscribe now to X Daily Stories, and let's keep the light on together.